Hi, everyone. Today I'm speaking to Aaron Erlich, and he's Associate Professor at Political Science Department at McGill University. Hi, Aaron.
Hi, nice to be with you here today.
Thanks, Aaron. Aaron, so what's your view on the latest developments in Ukraine?
It's a difficult question. As I think many of us feel that there's a lot of uncertainty, particularly though the EU has come in with a lot of funding, the uncertainty of U.S. funding and the continued small losses around the front. I think and some uncertainty among Ukrainian military leadership and what's going to happen there. I think people have a degree of worry. There's a lot of uncertainty. I'm definitely not, as an academic, I'm a little bit one step removed, so I can't necessarily follow everything every day. But I'm personally worried, though. I think it's a little unclear what the outlook is, and I think a lot of people are waiting to see. From my position, I'm trying to step back a little bit more and study some of the trends in Ukraine about people's change in behavior after the conflict, the full invasion. Well, after the first the annexation of Crimea and invasion of Donbass, which I think really is an important part of the story to tell, and people often forget, though Ukrainians are very fond of reminding us that we often do forget that so much of what Ukraine was able to do after 2022 was really the groundwork had been set much earlier. So I think there's been a lot of positive changes. There are some things to worry about as well. And the funding and the military situation continues to be difficult.
And Aaron, you have published quite a bit about pro-Kremlin propaganda.
Yeah.
So could you tell briefly what's your opinion about that, about application of propaganda by Kremlin in Ukraine? Has it been successful or no?
Okay, so that's a great question. Thank you. So I think I recently published 2 papers, and I have another one in the field right now on actually asking Ukrainians about using actually real stories that were circulated widely in Ukraine that were seen as pro-Kremlin propaganda, and actually asking Ukrainians what they thought about these stories, and trying to really understand, are these messages, penetrating, and what kind of variation is there in who might believe these stories. One thing to say about the stories themselves, or the narratives, depending on the word you like to use, is that it's really clear, and I'm not the first one, though there maybe sometimes this is associated with me, is that the ways that the Kremlin stories come out are just follow very strongly in Soviet footsteps. And so many scholars had actually forgotten this whole literature that came out in the 1980s from KGB defectors who came out and wrote books about exactly the types of techniques that were being used in the Soviet era to try to disseminate disinformation and misinformation, and to try to really aid to engage in a form of information warfare to help the Soviet side. And one thing that's true, that if you look at the stories, they can really be grouped into the types of stories that are favored, and the same types of stories that are favored today are the same types of stories that were favored 40 years ago. And the first set of stories, of course, has to do with building up Russia, making Russia look better than it actually is, trying to convince people that Russia has more to offer than it might. The second are stories that really, try to make the West and NATO or the EU, different flavors for different times, the West or NATO, or the U.S. look, worse than it is. And the third, which is really was very prevalent in Ukraine up, before 2015, but then really between 2015 and 2022 in a massive amount, was trying to make the government of whatever country that Russia pro-Kremlin propaganda is targeting look bad. Just make them look, incompetent, or I think they just can't get over it. The Russians tie everybody to the Nazis. So and you hear it all the time, and all the way that people talk is, Yatsenuk has, whatever, some Nazi, Chrystia Freeland's, who was Canadian, but his family was Russian, ancestors are Nazis. So there's a lot of trying to, stain people's, historical, ancestry and things like that. But it also goes to, really tries to impugn their leadership. The other type of way that the KGB and the pro-Kremlin propaganda appears to work is the way that they target stories. So they use these different strategies, undermining a country's government, trying to make their own government look better, trying to make Western governments look worse, but also then in different spheres. And they target stories historically, like all these Nazis type stories, very prevalent, which is a little bit like, a sign that it's coming from one place. It's a little unusual because those stories are actually the ones, at least in my research, people believe the least in Ukraine. But somehow the propagandists are very tied to these stories. And then there are stories about the military, often stories about corruption in the military, corruption in the Ukrainian military, or ways of undermining NATO and what NATO is doing. Stories, and then there's stories about the economy across, across all these different types. So there's, stories about how Russia's economy is doing better, stories about how Ukraine's economy is doing worse, and often comparative, like the EU is not really importing Ukrainian goods, for example, and it would be so much better if it had been gone. This is before the invasion. This type of narrative. They've changed slightly after the invasion, but the same kind of flavor continues. We saw that then with the biolab story, for example, where the U.S. was building biolabs in Ukraine, was a very common piece of disinformation after. And so these kind of different strategies, the amount of each of these strategies varies somewhat over time, and the different kind of grouping, economic stories, military stories, political stories, historical stories, change over time, but they all continue to exist over time as well. And so what we did in these two different studies is, first we kind of grouped all these. There's an amazing database, the EU versus Disinfo, which, if people are not aware of, kind of is a project by EU Stratcom, which categorizes and groups pro-Kremlin propaganda stories, and so allows you to see where all these different kind of pro-Kremlin propaganda stories are. If you want to cut me off, just cut me off at any time, by the way. And so we actually asked samples of the Ukrainian population what they thought about lots of different types of these stories, both in all these different types of strategies. So stories that are about the military, but were about undermining NATO, or stories about the military, but we're making Russia look good, and so on and so forth. And basically what we found is that on average, even before the 2022 invasion, Ukrainians were very, very good at actually sniffing out pro-Kremlin propaganda. People were very aware, much more so than one might have imagined. The one area where seemed that there was some softness in Ukrainians' view, which is for watchers of Ukraine is not altogether unsurprising, is economic stories. And because the Ukrainian economy had faltered for so long in the 90s, it was, continued to have there continued to be issues with corruption, though in a diminished amount. Ukrainians have a lot of trouble, I think, believing good economic news often about Ukraine, particularly Ukrainians who don't live in places that are doing well economically. So if you live in the countryside, or you live somewhere that's economically depressed, in the East where a factory has shut down, or the mining isn't going very well anymore, then it's not altogether unsurprising that when you hear good news about the economy, it's very hard for you to believe it. So disinformation on the economy was sometimes more believable than other disinformation stories, and so that was all very that was good news for Ukraine. And then one other thing we found was that we actually did there's a bunch of work in the U.S. trying to figure out how people can be encouraged to not believe disinformation. And there's a lot of programming going on in Ukraine right now to actually work on media literacy. There's a large U.S. government funded program by IREX working on that. But what we did is we worked with some psychologists to look at critical thinking or analytical thinking skills. And what we found was the same thing was true, that people who had higher analytical thinking skills were much less likely to believe disinformation in Ukraine. And generally what this suggests is that there's room for intervention here, whereas if you can get people to focus more on what they're reading in the Ukrainian context, then they're more likely to not believe disinformation stories, and it also doesn't affect what they think about true stories often, because we don't want people to just not believe the news at all anymore. And so I'm being a bit long-winded, but so maybe I'll stop there. Those were the first two stories. We're running studies. The next study we're running is actually we're randomly assigning bilingual Ukrainians to read stories in either Russian or Ukrainian, to see what language people consume information actually affects the way they believe stories. And we think this is actually a very important time to do that, because as you'll be very aware of, there's been a massive switch to Ukrainian language in Ukraine, where people are now often refusing to speak Russian, or really trying very hard to speak Ukrainian, or trying very hard to consume media in Ukrainian as well. And so with that shift, it's going to be interesting to see how consumption patterns and how belief in information often changes as people change the language in which they consume information in Ukraine.
So you mentioned that some Ukrainians cannot discern this propaganda from facts on economic subjects, right?
Yeah.
And overall, more or less, Ukrainians understand where Russia tries to brainwash them, right?
On other topics, they seem to be better. So that on political topics and historical topics and military topics, again, there is variation, but on average, generally speaking, Ukrainians are very good at discerning this pro-Kremlin propaganda.
And this survey was done before the war, right?
Yeah, the survey was done before the war. The one we were actually in the field with this second survey, which was showing people disinformation in both Russian and Ukrainian, and the war broke out, and so we had to stop it because of the full-scale invasion, and so now we're back in the field after the full-scale invasion now. So I'll have some more updates soon, because basically survey research became very difficult during the full-scale invasion. It started up again, but academics tend to work a little bit more slowly than sometimes we would like.
Sure, I understand. Yeah. And do you have respondents all across Ukraine, right? I mean,
all across Ukraine, of course, not in because in the occupied territories, the Russians have reconnected all the phone lines to Russian cellular network. Now, of course, after the full-scale invasion, we can't interview people in the occupied territories. Before the full-scale invasion, between 2014 and 2022, there were a few scholars who did manage to survey people in Donbass, in the occupied parts of Donbass. But the studies that we carried out were only in territories controlled by the Ukrainian government.
I see. So those findings that you have achieved, do you think that it shows that Ukrainian government should do some more work to counteract those Russia propaganda techniques?
I think that it shows that what has been done in terms, both on the civil society level, we see lots of really strong civil society efforts, organizations like Texty or some of the fact-checking organizations in Ukraine have really done an excellent job. And, you know, the government, there's been laws passed to help promote media literacy. I mean, I think in that sense, Ukraine is a real success story compared to a lot of other countries. And I think that actually the problems are elsewhere. You know, you know, it's funny, you know, usually researchers on a certain topic said, yes, the government should, you know, focus their efforts on this. But I think actually the story is like, keep doing what you're doing, you know, on this front, and you have a lot of other things to work on as well. So, you know, hold the course, continue what you're doing, but it's be careful of the economic issues, work on countering that. But for the other stuff, you know, the job is being pretty well done.
Yeah, so that's good to hear. Yeah, because it seems that they are using those techniques. You mentioned they from the Soviet times, right? That they haven't changed much, right?
No, and what's interesting is that they, you know, it doesn't seem that, at least from the outside, you know, that there has been as much adaptation as one would have had expected. One would have had expected more adaptation than there has been.
And so, and what's your view on the latest interview of Putin and
Carlson? I have to say I couldn't bear to watch the whole. I couldn't bear to watch the whole thing, so I don't have I haven't seen the whole thing. I mean, it's. I mean, Putin hasn't changed his narrative. I mean, it's nothing, you know, Tucker Carlson seems shocked, but I don't know. Were you shocked? So I, you know, I don't know. I mean, Putin apparently has done this with foreign interview, you know, before every election cycle, he does an interview with the foreign media. So this isn't something new for Putin. He's used to doing this, you know, once an election cycle or so. Maybe slightly more, but so I think you know, from Putin's perspective, this is just what he does, and he's, you know, doing it again, despite the fact that, you know, other journalists, U.S. journalists, are in prison in Russia. But I think it made Tucker Carlson for most people just look very silly, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and. So you mentioned about something important, I think. So about that more critical approach.
Yeah.
Those people that read more and think more. I guess that's what Ukrainians should focus on, right? And more analytical thinking, because that way they're less susceptible to this.
That's right. But I think the full-scale invasion context and the context of 2014, 2015 has really helped Ukrainians realize that in a really profound way. And like when I talk to my Ukrainian, you know, friends, they say, yeah, we always, you know, triangulate. We always check multiple sources. We always think, you know, because of everything that's going on, you know, decision making has become very important. And so people have realized in all areas of their life, including media consumption, the importance of some of this. But I think more can always be done on that front. But, you know, Ukraine has there's been legal reform about media literacy at the university level, and, you know, integrating that into, you know, into education. So I think that's a great direction. You know, to be frank, more of that needs to be done in the North American context. So I think Ukraine can be a real leader on that. It has really something important to share with the rest of the world as a success story in this area.
And do you think Ukrainian case can improve the information environment in other countries facing similar campaigns?
I think one of the things that, you know, hopefully when Ukraine regains territory and the conflict comes to an end, I think we will see, actually, if you were asked me to predict, which is always problematic, but I think, you know, one of the things I was just writing to somebody else, one of the things that I think will come out of this is that Ukraine has just gained so much experience in logistics management, like complex among civil society, right? Among complex logistics management and complex information management, that there will be a large industry that emerges in Ukraine to actually work in other parts of the world in these spheres. Because what the full-scale invasion has done has really brought a whole bunch of people that were working in other areas, right? Like people who are in tech outsourcing, right? People who are doing back-end computer development for some large US software company, and brought them and forced them to take their skills and work in other areas like countering propaganda and building robust monitoring of disinformation and providing support, logistical support for the Ukrainian armed forces. All of these skills are just gonna, hopefully, if the things that are uncertain now go in the right direction, I think are going to really help Ukraine become a leader in these types of industries that are continuing to grow. I mean, you see a lot of these types of industries becoming very profitable in the North American context, where you have to write, in software to help companies manage threats, for example, from disinformation. Companies are threatened all the time by, people saying bad things online about them. Their products could, stop working. So in a positive world, if things go in the right direction, I think this real force, this push by Russia to actually engage with this is going to create a bunch of skills that could be potentially very lucrative and helpful to Ukrainian entrepreneurs and business in the long term. Of course, it's all up in the air. One can't say, but if it goes well, I could see that happening.
And do you feel like this Russian disinformation campaign has succeeded in a way because Ukraine hasn't secured that much help lately?
Yeah, it is interesting to think about, right? I mean, it's not necessarily, disinformation in a way. I mean, but right, there was all this information coming out from the West, right? That and you read it on Twitter all the time, and of course, I believe some of it as well, right? That Russia just couldn't hold out anymore, right? They didn't have any more soldiers. Too many soldiers were being killed on the battle. You saw all the pictures of, all the information of, Ukrainian drones dropping grenades on drunk Russian soldiers in, bunkers. There was a lot of Western media that focused on Ukraine, on Russia falling apart, and it hasn't, right? And Putin has said the whole time that this is not disinformation in a way, right? That we are holding the course, right? We are going to outlast the West. And that wasn't, in a sense, disinformation. That was genuine. And so that gamesmanship, to an extent, has worked, or is in jeopardy of working, right? It's a risk that's going to work, that Russia is just, willing to hold on, longer at a cost that is unbelievable to people who value, human life more than those in Russia do. So the one area that, I don't know if it's true that the propaganda has worked. It's an easy out for those in the Republican Party in the U.S. And I'm now not talking about my research. I'm just having a conversation, which is that, there has, of course, we have to admit that corruption has been a historical issue in Ukraine, that Ukraine has been plagued by corruption. I've done a bunch of research on anti-corruption messaging and corruption in Ukraine. On the other hand, we also have to admit that pro-Kremlin propaganda has really focused a lot of its attention on corruption-related issues and how corrupt Ukraine is. And one easy out for Republicans now who are opposing aid to Ukraine is that Ukraine is corrupt. And so it's hard to know, is it the effect of the pro-Kremlin propaganda that's helping Republicans to say this, or would they have just said it anyhow because it was known beforehand? but it certainly didn't help that all of these stories were a large focus of pro-Kremlin propaganda. It's easy for probably becomes easier for Republicans to focus on it, but we have to admit that there is that underlying issue that Ukraine is still grappling with now.
Because I feel they're like pushing this message: Ukraine's going to lose anyway. You don't help. You don't help.
Right.
Through social media, especially, they try to push it.
Well, one of the things that the political leaders on the Republican side are talking about is not just that Ukraine is going to lose anyway, but that Ukraine is squandering the money, which is that Ukraine is not using the money effectively because it's a corrupt country. And so, that is also a story, a way of talking about Ukraine that aligns with pro-Kremlin propaganda. Now, it's hard to say whether the pro-Kremlin propaganda caused the Republicans to talk this way or not, if you understand. But like the message is certainly out there. In addition to not just to like, oh, it's not going to, Ukraine can't win, is that Ukraine is, squandering the money. I see,
Aaron. I ran out of my questions, Aaron. And is there anything else you think you could mention? Important.
Thank you for the opportunity to chat, and I wish you very well in this endeavor. I think it's great, and keep supporting Ukraine, and I appreciate talking to you.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for your time today.
You're very welcome.